Welcome back to KD&D, the show where we talk about all things Dungeons & Dragons. Today I want to talk to you guys about the One D&D playtest materials that were just released on October 1st. If you don't know already where to find these things, you're going to want to go to D&D Beyond and go under the Sources tab, click on One D&D, and then I'm going to be talking today about the Expert Classes one. You can watch their video here talking about it and download the PDF right here. I'm just going to quickly go through the last couple pages of the PDF, which is the Rules Glossary. Now there's a lot here. I might split this up into two videos. A lot of the stuff here in the Rules Glossary is core to, I think, a lot of the changes they're going to make to the game. So the first thing I figured I would talk about is going to be the D20 test. A D20 test is basically replacing the term that I think we used as like a check. A D20 test boils down to three different things: an ability check, a attack roll, or a saving throw. You can apply skill proficiencies, they explain, to ability checks if the rules or a dungeon master determine them relevant to that test. The rules may ask for a strength check, in parentheses, athletics or acrobatics. Now what I find most interesting about this is that if anyone knows much about 5e, you know that acrobatics is a dexterity-based skill. So right here, it says strength check, acrobatics, or athletics. What this implies is that if you're making a check that is at its core based on your strength, but there's a reasonable explanation for why your acrobatics proficiency could assist with this, then you could add your acrobatics proficiency to this strength test. And the best example I can think of that right in my brain is if your character was trying to climb up after hanging on to a cliff, and instead of like brute climbing their way up, maybe they kind of kick in their feet and like climb up quickly and do a little bit of a flip to get up onto the top. More of an acrobatic maneuver. It does say that most ability checks require an action. Several of these things are named actions, such as hide and influence, which seems to be their replacement for an intimidation or a persuasion check. You can influence them on an influence check, but whether you use persuasion or intimidation is going to depend on you and the narrative. Another thing that I liked here, it says the DM may override this requirement, the requirement that an action is required, make it a bonus action or as no action at all. I really like this. I think one way to make your battles a little bit more dynamic is to allow players an opportunity to do a free skill check of sorts within combat. For example, if they're trying to get an idea of the lay of the land, I might offer a free perception check in my combats. Another thing that you could maybe have is an insight check to see if they can figure out how damaged an opponent is or how much of a will to fight they still have left with them. Maybe a sleight of hand check to quickly untie a rope that's going to cause a chandelier to drop on the bad guy. Continuing on, it discusses difficulty class, and the difficulty class chart has remained, as far as I can tell, completely unchanged. It then moves into armor training, which is the new verbiage for armor proficiency. I feel like that is a much more natural and easy to understand term for it. The next thing on the list in there is the Artisan's Tools. Basically, all they've changed here is that all Artisan's Tools now cost 15 gold. In the 5e rules, they could cost anywhere between like 1 gold for woodcarver's tools, all the way to 50 gold for things like alchemists, tinkerers, and jewel crafters' tools. I don't know what the exact motivation is here. I like the simplicity of it. I feel like narratively it doesn't always make sense. Like, it makes sense that a wood chisel costs a lot less than, you know, a kit of alchemy supplies, but perhaps what they're trying to do is prevent like the min-maxing of like, oh, I'm going to pick this background so I can get this tool for free, and then I'm going to sell that tool for an extra 50 gold so I can start with 2 more healing potions, perhaps. I don't hate it. It just seems like maybe a solution that didn't have a problem. It talks about the attack action, clarifying that you can draw a weapon as part of your attack action, which I think most dungeon masters do anyway. I did have one dungeon master one time that anytime I wanted to switch from casting spells as my bard to pulling out a crossbow, it cost me an action, which meant every single time I didn't want to just do nothing except cast Vicious Mockery, I had to burn an action to pull out my crossbow and wait for my next turn so I could fire it. I didn't play with that DM for long. Continuing on, it talks about attack rolls, nothing crazy here. Arcane spells, which is one of the 3 new branches of spells. There's Arcane, Divine, and Primal. It does have some new reworks of spells in here. I'm not going to get super in-depth on all of them. Barkskin's right here. Basically, all they did is change it to, well, I don't want to say basically, they changed it significantly. It is now a bonus action that gives temporary HP instead of an action that gives a flat armor class. Which seems like a nerf until you look at the higher levels thing here. You can now upcast it to target more than one creature. So I like the thematicism of that, but mechanically it might be a little bit weaker. But the idea that a druid or someone else with this primal magic could give regrowing barkskin to multiple members of their party in a combat is pretty cool. Talks about blind sight, which doesn't seem to have changed much, just kind of specifies it. Explains a bit about climb speed and how climb speed could be used in place of your regular speed if it's usable that way. The creature types, from what I can tell at the quick glance, there are no new creature types. There's the D20 test thing we talked about earlier, and it references heroic inspiration, which I'm going to talk about in a minute here. Here's the dash action. Talking about difficult terrain. I like the clarification here on difficult terrain. The way that it operates has not changed. It just costs you double movement. And then it gives examples here. A difficult terrain would be anything where you're passing through a space. If it has a creature that isn't tiny, furniture that's large or small, heavy snow, heavy undergrowth, going down here to ice, liquid between shin and waist deep, otherwise you're swimming if it's any deeper. So the one thing I'm noticing here is with this right here, any creature that isn't tiny. Based off this rules, this would imply that you can no longer, and I don't know how it's been, but in most games I've played, Dungeon Masters have allowed you to move through an ally's space without incurring difficult terrain. The idea being, if you're trying to run through your ally's space, they'll quickly kind of get out of the way or help you through. But based off this ruling, it's any creature that isn't tiny. And one thing that does do is give tiny and small creatures like halflings and gnomes a cool little, flavor that they can dart through people's legs. Next up here is the exhausted condition, and I really like the way that they've changed this. Instead of exhaustion being this random assortment of negative things that happen to your character, off the top of my head, first level in 5e exhaustion is half movement. I'm already wrong. First level is disadvantage on all ability checks. Second level is half movement. Third level is maybe a penalty to your armor class, unless that's fourth, but the idea that it's so hard to remember is kind of my biggest problem with exhaustion, which is a shame because I feel like exhaustion is one of the most natural punishments to something like a skill challenge that's failed, or one of the best ways to represent the difficulty of traveling through a world that is hostile to you, like a hostile winter environment or a dense jungle filled with blood-sucking insects. What this new Unearthed Arcana does is it gives up to 10 levels of exhaustion, a little bit much for my mind, but for every 1 level of exhaustion, you take -1 to any D20 test. So that's ability checks, attack rolls, and saving throws. So simple. If you have 2 levels of exhaustion, that's -2 on any D20 roll. You still have to burn an entire 8-hour rest to get rid of a level of exhaustion, which is very punishing. If you have 8 levels of exhaustion, you got to rest for a week. I would probably home rule that, lesser restoration or greater restoration could reduce a certain number of levels. But the cool thing is, since 6 levels doesn't outright kill you, and you have 10 levels available to play with, I'm guessing they're going to have some monsters that will incur an exhausted condition on your opponents, which is a really cool effect. Like you have the shadow in the 5e monster manual that drains someone's strength. I really like the idea of some sort of undead, like absorbing your life force, making you exhausted. But if you're going through an entire dungeon with monsters like that, you're going to have a lot of resting on your hands. Which, depending on the pacing of your game, that wouldn't be a huge issue, but I can see where some people would take issue with that. But overall, I'm a big fan of the new exhaustion mechanic. Okay, moving right along. Expertise. Expertise basically explains how that doubles your skill proficiency. Earlier in this UA, it talks about how the bard, the ranger, and the rogue are all going to have some sort of expertise, which I like. Talks about flying speed, clarifies that if you fall incapacitated while flying, you will fall, unless you have the hover trait. Gaming sets are a different type of artisan's tool that all cost 1 gold a piece now, so that's going to be like a chess set, a card set. Big changes here to the grappled condition. In 5e, the only thing that happened with grappled was if you were grappling something, you made its speed 0. Well, now it clarifies that if you are grappled, you now have a disadvantage on all attack rolls except for something that's the thing that's grappling you. You can now be moved. The grappler takes half movement speed to do that. And then you have an opportunity to escape for free at the end of each one of your turns. That's the one thing I don't really like about it. I would probably make that cost a reaction. Just because I like the fantasy of like a fighter or a monk or a barbarian getting in, grappling something so it can't take attacks of opportunity against their allies as they're rushing past. And if you have to spend a reaction to take an attack at disadvantage or a reaction to try and break the grapple, I feel like that's a pretty good trade-off. The next thing on the list here is the new guidance spell. As far as my thoughts here, it's now only done as a reaction to a failed check. So this looks like someone who wanted to get rid of the, let's just say, the critical role use of guidance. So what I mean by the critical role effect is anytime someone's about to roll a d20, you have a player walking over and saying, guidance, you know, and adding that d4 to the roll. Now it's only done if someone fails a check, but then if you look here at the bottom, once the creature rolls the dice for this spell, the creature can't benefit from guidance again until they take a long rest, which hugely nerfs guidance in my opinion. If you think about it, the way it currently was, guidance could get cast like 20 times in Adventuring Day, which is probably too much, but with this rule, assuming an adventuring party of 4 or 5 people, you know, the person using guidance would be able to use it once on each person and then themselves. So this cantrip can only get used 5 times, but think of how often things like Firebolt or Guiding, gosh, what's the... I'm gonna cut and remember when I remember the name of this. Sacred Flame. So think of how often Firebolt and Sacred Flame get used, and then Guidance is kind of being nerfed a little bit here. I like that it's done as a reaction to a fail, but I would probably get rid of that limitation. Clarifying here of the help action, you know, you can, I think a lot of people do this anyway. If you are proficient in a skill, you can use the help action to give advantage on an ability check with that skill. Assisting in an attack action. Heroic Inspiration is the replacement of DM Inspiration, or the new terminology. In the original release of the UA here, they had made it so that anytime you got a natural 20, you got a Heroic Inspiration or a DM Inspiration. I and a lot of other creators were kind of talking about how it would be a lot cooler on the opposite end of the spectrum, where if you roll a natural 1, you now get advantage. And I've run that in a couple of my games with some new players, and I gotta tell you, it's a really great mechanic. Some new players can be really discouraged if they get a d20 that's rolling really low consistently, but after a couple of natural 1s, if you have a DM Inspiration, it's like a safety net, right? It's like, oh, okay, well, I've been rolling like crap, but at least I have a reroll on something in the future. So I really like this edition, and I hope they keep it, and even if they don't, I'm going to keep using it. It says you can only have 1 Heroic Inspiration at a time. If you get a Heroic Inspiration while you already have one, you can give it to another player. Here's the hidden condition. Clarifies a few things about it, how it works. More or less, I think it functions the same. The hide action, now you must make a DC 15 dexterity stealth check. You have to be heavily obscured or behind 3/4 cover, which I believe it's always been the case. Usually when I run hide in my games, you make a check versus the person that's trying to perceive you, perception check, so it's more contested, kind of like grappling used to be. I think I'll probably kind of keep that, but I think for simplicity's sake, applying just a flat 15 to it seems nice. So in the next video, we will go through the latter half of the rules glossary, but I hope you learned something new. Let me know what you think of these new rules. Are you going to use some of this stuff? Are you more preferential to using something from 5th edition? If you're someone who's played older editions, get in the comments and tell me how much Dungeons & Dragons is just stealing from Pathfinder or stealing from old editions. Love hearing people talking about all of that because, yeah, right, like, how dare they take something that's working well and implement it into their games, you know? But on that less than sarcastic note, I will leave you. Thank you guys so much for swinging by, and I hope to see you next time. Like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. Peace out.